There is a moment inside every long power struggle when the person who has been losing finally understands that they have lost. Not the moment they are told, not the moment a statement goes out, the moment they walk into a room and feel the air in it has changed, and there is nothing left to push against. Camilla reached that moment recently, and it did not arrive with the announcement or a confrontation or a dramatic scene anybody could photograph. It arrived through a door to Windsor Lodge that stopped being hers, and the two people who closed it did not raise their voices, did not speak to a single journalist, and did not leave a fingerprint on any of it that anyone could point to and call an attack. They simply built the ground underneath it until it was solid, and then they let the building do the talking. I am Harold. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family, the records, the property documents, the institutional filings that sit in archives nobody reads unless it is their actual job. The reporting that got 3 paragraphs in a Tuesday edition and then disappeared before anybody finished asking the questions it raised. I go through all of it. I sit with the pieces until the shape underneath them becomes clear, and then I tell you what I read, not what the palace wants you to hear, not what a sympathetic correspondent was briefed to pass along over lunch, not the version that has been sanded smooth by 3 layers of communications advisors before it reaches you. What you are about to hear is me putting this together the way I read it. And I want to be straight with you from the start, the way I always try to be. Some of what follows is documented. Some of it comes from sources close to the household, who are not going to put their names to it. I will tell you which is which as we go, because the difference matters and you deserve to know it. Stay with me to the end, because the last section of this story contains a detail about what Camilla is walking into every single morning inside that building now. And I think it will stay with you. So let me start with the building itself, because you cannot understand why losing it matters without understanding what Windsor Lodge actually is. Most people who follow this family know Windsor Castle. The towers, the staterooms, the changing of the guard, the wall that has been keeping the world at a manageable distance from the monarchy for 1,000 years. Windsor Lodge is something different. It sits on the Windsor estate, close enough to the castle to be inside its gravitational pull, and private enough to feel like a separate world entirely. It is not a grace and favor property in the way that phrase usually lands, meaning a minor perk handed to a distant cousin or a retiring member of staff. Windsor Lodge is a significant royal residence with its own grounds, its own history, and its own weight inside the institution. The history of who has lived there and who has been allowed to live there tells you more about the real internal rankings of that family than any official order of precedence ever printed. It is not on the tourist maps. It does not appear in the brochures. And that invisibility is precisely the point, because the residences that matter most inside that world are almost always the ones nobody puts on a sign. Senior members of the royal household understand this instinctively. Where you live on that estate is a statement about where you stand inside it. The two things are not separate. They are the same thing expressed in stone and postcode rather than in words. Camilla moved into Windsor Lodge, and she did not move in quietly. That matters. Because the decision about which royal lives where on the Windsor estate is not made by the person moving. It is made by the institution, which, in practical terms, means it is made by whoever holds the most authority inside the institution at the moment the decision lands. And for years, that person was Charles. He arranged it because he could arrange it, and because nobody with the standing to challenge it was yet in a position to do so. William was watching. He was always watching. He simply had not yet accumulated enough institutional authority to act on what he saw. That day was always coming. Camilla appears to have believed for a very long time that it was not. Now let me take you back to the beginning of how she got her hands on it, because the story of Camilla acquiring Windsor Lodge is not a story about a wife being given a home by her husband. It is a story about institutional positioning, and it has Camilla's fingerprints all over every step of it. When Charles became king in September 2022, the question of which senior royals would live where became suddenly and urgently relevant in a way it had not been for 70 years. Every significant royal property on every estate had to be reassigned, reconsidered, or confirmed. That is a bureaucratic process on the surface. Underneath the surface, it is a power map. Whoever ends up in the significant properties is whoever the person at the top of the institution has decided matters. Camilla understood this better than almost anyone else in that building. She had spent 30 years studying how the institution works from the inside, while officially being kept outside of it. She knew that the moment Charles sat on that throne, she had a window, and she moved through it quickly, quietly, and with the kind of precision that tells you she had been planning the approach for a very long time. Windsor Lodge was identified. Windsor Lodge was secured. And the people who noticed the speed of that move, who looked at it and felt something uncomfortable without being able to name it precisely, were the same people who had spent years watching Diana's presence disappear from the walls of that family's homes, piece by piece. There is a detail in this that most of the coverage never landed on properly. Windsor Lodge, in the years before Camilla moved in, had been arranged around a particular kind of use, not as a primary residence for a senior royal with a full household and a diary full of official engagements, as a quieter, more private space. The kind of place that senior members of the family used when they needed to be close to Windsor without being inside the castle itself. Camilla changed that entirely. She moved in with staff, with resources, with the full weight of a working royal's household establishment. She turned it into something it had not previously been, because she could, because Charles was king, and because William was not yet king. That last point is the one that matters, because William was always going to be king. And Camilla knew that too. Now here is where you have to slow down and sit with the weight of what was building underneath all of this. Because none of what William eventually did makes sense unless you understand what he had been carrying since he was 15 years old and what he had been watching happen to his mother's memory for 2 decades inside the very buildings this family calls home. Diana was erased. I do not use that word loosely. It was not a gradual fading, not a natural process of time moving forward and memories softening. It was deliberate. And it was systematic, and it was done in pieces small enough that objecting to any single one of them would have made you look unreasonable. The flowers she had chosen, the arrangements she had kept throughout the rooms she lived in, gone. Not replaced, burned. There is a very specific decision being communicated when you burn something rather than throw it away, and everyone in that household understood which decision they were being handed. Her bedroom, the room where she had slept, where she had held her boys, where she had written in private when there was no one left to talk to, locked, not occupied, locked permanently, as though sealing off a room that contained something shameful. Her portrait, the one that had been meant for the Hall of Matriarchs at Windsor, the wall reserved for the women who actually shaped this monarchy, vanished into a storage room where it sat in the dark for over 20 years. 20 years. Foreign heads of state walked past that wall. Prime ministers walked past it. Her sons walked past it at every family occasion of their adult lives and counted the faces and knew exactly whose was not there. William counted too. He counted every single time. And he said nothing. He shook Camilla's hand at Christmas. He stood next to her in photographs. He supported her elevation publicly and on camera with a face that gave nothing away. because he had understood something at 16 that most people never understand at any age. That saying a true thing at the wrong moment gets you nothing except the satisfaction of having said it. He was not interested in the satisfaction. He was interested in the outcome. And the outcome required patience of a kind that most people cannot sustain for a month, let alone a quarter of a century. There is a letter underneath all of this that I think about whenever I try to understand what William is actually running on. In October of 1995, 2 years before she died, Diana wrote to her solicitor. She stated that she believed her husband was planning to have her killed in a staged car accident. She wrote about brake failure, serious head injury, leaving him free to move on. 2 years later, she died in a car crash in a tunnel in Paris. That letter was handed to police after her death and sat in a drawer for 6 years. 6 years. Nobody has ever given a satisfying account of those 6 years, and William eventually read every word of what his mother had been afraid enough to put in writing and hand to a lawyer in the last 2 years of her life. Watch what he does with the rest of his life, because that letter is sitting underneath every single decision. Now, before Windsor Lodge, before any of this came to a head, something else happened that cracked the foundation Camilla had been standing on. And I covered this in detail in a previous video, but you need the shape of it here because it is the reason the Windsor Lodge move became possible when it did. The yacht scandal broke in the summer of 2025. Camilla had spent 5 days aboard a private super yacht called the Esperanza III, registered in Malta, owned through a holding company in Luxembourg, and belonging to a Swiss-based financier whose name appeared nowhere in her official schedule, nowhere in her public diary, and nowhere in any palace press release across that entire summer. And here's the detail that reframes everything. William had put new governance rules in writing, rules about outside relationships, gifts, hospitality from anyone with financial interests connected to the crown. Those rules had been sent to the households of every senior royal. They were mandatory, not a polite suggestion. Camilla's office received that document. She went on the trip anyway. The atmosphere inside Kensington Palace afterwards was described by royal sources as one of controlled fury. And if you understand how William actually operates, that phrase should chill you far more than any story about shouting ever could. Because William does not shout. He does not leak. He does not grant interviews to explain his side. What he does is remove people. He removed his own brother from the royal institution. He removed Annabel Elliot from the Duchy of Cornwall payroll without a single public word. He forced Prince Andrew out of Royal Lodge through a process so patient and so methodical that by the time it was finished, Andrew had no cards left to play. Everyone who knows William says the same thing every time. When he decides something is over, it is completely over. And the yacht scandal did something more damaging than simply giving him a reason to act. It exposed the one thing Camilla's entire security inside the institution had always rested on: Charles's ability to shield her. Charles was in cancer treatment. His working pattern had changed. His capacity to fight a prolonged internal battle on his wife's behalf against a son who held every document and every institutional advantage had quietly narrowed. Not because he lost the title, because the day-to-day gravity of the institution had already been shifting toward William for months, and everyone inside knew it. The willing part of Charles's protection was never in doubt. It was the able part that had quietly failed. And when that gap opened, William moved through it. Here's the part of this story that most of the coverage has consistently underestimated. Catherine was not standing to the side watching this unfold. She was inside it. She was building alongside William with the same patience and the same precision. And the role she played in the restructuring that led to Windsor Lodge is the part that tells you this was never simply about one man's anger at his stepmother. After the yacht scandal, royal patronages that Diana had built and championed began reappearing. Charities Diana had poured herself into started showing up in William's official schedule and, critically, in Catherine's. The Edinburgh Women's Leadership Conference. Two significant charity dinners that had originally been Camilla's. Catherine's office confirmed her attendance within a week of the reassignments, which tells you her team knew those slots were opening before Camilla's team had finished processing the change. That is not reactive. That is coordinated, and it is the fingerprint of two people working toward the same outcome from different angles rather than one person acting alone. Catherine understood something important about how this transition needed to look. It could not look like a war. It could not look like a daughter-in-law seizing territory from a stepmother-in-law. It had to look like a natural evolution. New priorities, new directions, new energy flowing toward the charities and causes that needed it most. And underneath that entirely reasonable surface, the spaces Camilla had occupied were being filled, one, by a woman whose presence in those spaces carried a very specific message to everyone paying close enough attention to read it. The organizations that received Catherine in place of Camilla were not confused by the substitution. They were grateful for the continuity, and that gratitude landed in exactly the right place. Because an institution that is grateful to Catherine for showing up is an institution that is quietly, irrevocably repositioning itself around Catherine, which is the point, which was always the point. Now let me take you into the mechanics of how William actually removed Camilla from Windsor Lodge, because this is the part that tells you what kind of man is going to be running this country. He did not walk into her drawing room and tell her to pack her things. He did not make a phone call that anybody could quote. He did not issue a single word to the press. What he did was build a legal and institutional framework so carefully, so methodically, and so completely that by the time any of it became visible from the outside, it was already finished and it was already irreversible. The work started months before any of it surfaced. William's team went through the historical records on Windsor Lodge and its occupancy going back decades. Who had lived there? On what basis? Under what terms? And what institutional precedent existed for each arrangement? They took meetings with property advisors, with legal counsel, with the senior household officials who understand how the architecture of royal property tenure actually functions. They identified every procedural step that would need to be taken, in what order, and they ticked every box before a single piece of furniture moved or a single staff member was reassigned. This is the thing about William that people consistently underestimate because he is so good at the public face of the job. The receiving lines, the engagements, the careful, measured public statements that give nothing away. Underneath all of that is a man who runs the Duchy of Cornwall, 135,000 acres generating roughly £30 million a year, who has in less than 4 years replaced outside contractors, restructured the management team, and cut every arrangement that ran on personal trust rather than a written agreement. He proved on a £1 billion estate that documentation is the only real protection before he ever applied that principle to Camilla. He did not arrive at Windsor Lodge improvising. He arrived having already won. And once the institutional groundwork was solid, the visible changes came. Not all at once. That is not how William operates, and it is not how these things work inside that building. A staff member whose role touched Windsor Lodge found their position quietly restructured as part of a broader household efficiency review. A communication channel that had run through Camilla's office was rerouted. A diary commitment tied to the lodge was reassigned to a different part of the family's operation, each piece small enough that objecting to any single one of them would make you look unreasonable, which is, of course, exactly the playbook that had been run on Diana's memory for 20 years. William had studied it. He had watched it work from the receiving end his entire life, and he understood it well enough to turn it around. There came a point where the confirmation could no longer be managed or minimized or absorbed into the background noise of normal palace administration, and it did not arrive through a dramatic announcement. It arrived the way these things always arrive in that world, through the diary. Camilla's connection to Windsor Lodge had always expressed itself practically through access, through staff, through the official correspondence and briefing documents that flow through a senior royal's household. When those things began to change, anyone paying close attention to the machinery of royal life could read the direction of travel. Engagements associated with the lodge disappeared from her schedule, not canceled, reassigned. The organizations involved were told the change was administrative and no further explanation was offered. Staff whose roles had been defined around her occupancy of the property found their positions reviewed, restructured, absorbed into other parts of the wider household. And the briefing documents, the private flow of institutional information that tells you where you stand inside the building more honestly than any title ever can, those narrowed from a broad distribution that reflected her position as a senior, working royal, down to a strict need to know basis. Foreign policy briefings stopped reaching her desk. Institutional briefings unrelated to her specific patronages stopped. She went from being kept informed as a matter of course to finding out what the family had decided at the same time as everyone else. And in that building, that is not an administrative change. That is a demolition. Information is the currency of influence in the royal household. It is how you shape decisions before they are made, how you get consulted, how people treat your opinion as something that has to be managed. Take it away, and the title stays exactly the same while the substance underneath it hollows out completely. By the time the word reached the press, the thing it was describing had already happened. Camilla had already lost Windsor Lodge in every way that matters. The formal confirmation was paperwork catching up to a decision that had been made and executed weeks earlier. That is how William works. That is how he has always worked. The announcement, if it comes at all, is the last thing, never the first. Now I want to talk about Charles, because you cannot tell this story honestly without standing in front of the most uncomfortable part of it and looking at it directly. Charles has spent 30 years fighting for this woman. Understand the scale of that before you judge what he did next. He fought the institution for her. He fought a public that despised her for years and made no secret of it. He fought the press. He fought his own sons, both of whom told him to his face not to marry her. He spent 3 decades being the one person in the world Camilla could absolutely rely on to stand up for her when nobody else would. And now, for the second time in recent months, he stood in a room with his wife furious and humiliated in front of him, waiting for him to pick up a phone and make this go away the way he always had. And he did nothing. He let his son's decisions stand. He let the institutional machinery William had built run its course without raising a single formal objection. He did not make one call. He did not send one letter. He chose the cheapest possible option for himself, which was silence, and he handed his wife the bill for it. The people who know Charles best have said for years that he has been privately asking William not to push Camilla out after he is gone. He knows exactly how deep his son's resentment runs. He has spent years trying to hold that resentment in place with his own hands, asking for patience, asking for time, asking for one more year of peace. And when the moment arrived that required more than asking, when it required him to actually stand in the gap and block what William was building, he went quiet. That is not a husband failing to defend his wife in an argument. That is a king sitting in a room and accepting that the reckoning he had been holding back for 25 years had finally walked through the door. And what makes his silence so much heavier than it looks on the surface is this: he could have stopped it. He is the king. One clear instruction to a private secretary, and the machinery stalls. The diary entries come back. The staff are reassigned in the other direction, and William has to rebuild from scratch. Charles did not give that instruction. Whatever calculation he made in the quiet of his own thinking, he made it and came out the other side having chosen his son's vision of the future over his wife's position in the present. Whether that was love for William, or exhaustion from the cancer treatment, or a private reckoning with what had been done to Diana that nobody outside that room will ever fully know, the result is the same. Camilla was on her own, and she felt it. Palace sources describe her reaction as one of genuine and uncontrolled fury, the kind that comes not from surprise but from a specific and sickening recognition. She had spent a very long time believing that Charles was the one thing nobody could take from her. And she discovered, standing in a corridor with staff carefully finding somewhere else to be, that the thing she had built her entire security around had quietly become something he could no longer reliably provide. Now let me tell you what Camilla is actually left with. Because the picture that remains after Windsor Lodge, after the diary changes, after the staff reductions, after the patronages that went to Catherine, is a picture that requires precision to describe honestly. She still holds her title. She still appears beside Charles at state occasions. On paper, the position exists, but paper and reality have been moving in opposite directions for months, and the gap between them is now wide enough that everybody inside that building can see it. Her dedicated household staff went from 11 people at the start of 2025 to 7 by November. The engagements Catherine stepped into are not coming back. The briefings that stopped are not resuming. And Windsor Lodge, the property she secured in the first days of the new reign, the building that represented the solidity and permanence of her position inside the institution, is no longer hers. She has the title of Queen Consort. She does not have the ground underneath it. And here's the thing that nobody inside that palace will say out loud, but that every senior official understands. When Charles dies, Camilla becomes Queen Dowager. She keeps the title and a residence, but the major estates pass to William. The institutional support she depends on, the staff, the access, the resources, the position at the center of the family's working life, all of it exists because Charles is king. When that changes, everything she has will depend more or less entirely on the generosity of a man who has spent 25 years quietly, methodically, patiently building toward a single evening where he put his mother's portrait back on the wall she was always owed, and did it so carefully that not one person could take it down again. How much generosity do you honestly believe is coming from that man? The spaces she used to fill are now Catherine's. The causes she championed are being tended by a woman whose name does not carry the complications Camilla's does, whose presence in a room does not require anyone to manage the history of how she got there. Catherine does not walk into a hospice or a charity dinner carrying the weight of everything Camilla carries. She walks in clean, and the organizations that receive her feel the difference immediately. Now, I have been holding something back since early in this story, and I want to give it to you properly, because it is the part that tells you this was never purely institutional. It was never just about property and diaries and staff numbers. There was a human moment at the edge of all of this that landed harder than any of the architecture William spent years building, and it was not in the plan. It was never in the plan. Princess Anne's role in the broader picture I have described across several videos now is one that most people outside that family have never fully understood. Anne has her own history with Camilla that goes back to 1973, to Andrew Parker Bowles, to a church in which Anne sat in the pews at his wedding, to another woman having been told she was not permitted to be the one standing up there. She has never said one public word about what that day cost her. She sat through the service, went to the reception, and has spent 50 years filing it away in the way that Anne files everything. Silently, permanently, without ever giving anybody the satisfaction of seeing it. Royal biographers have written for years that Camilla was deeply intimidated by Anne, that Anne's coldness toward her was nerve-wracking to be around, that whatever sat between those two women from 1973 was never resolved and was never going to be. And after the confirmation of Windsor Lodge became undeniable, Anne did what she apparently did in the corridor outside the throne room, and what she did in the gallery the night Diana's portrait went up. She walked into the room. No aides, no witnesses arranged, no one there to write it down in a way that could be softened later. She looked at Camilla and she said 5 words. She said it is what Diana deserved. Past tense, not deserves, not should have had, deserved. A debt that had been outstanding for 25 years, settled in full by somebody else, and named out loud by the one woman in that family Camilla has never been able to win over, charm, intimidate, or make bow to her. Not once. Not even after the crown went on. That sentence got out of the room the way things always get out of rooms at Windsor. And when it landed across that household in a single morning. The 5 words were the part nobody scheduled and nobody prepared for. And that followed Camilla down every corridor in that building in a way that the institutional mechanics of Windsor Lodge never could. Because you can rebuild an institutional position. You can fight for staff and for diary entries and for briefing documents. You cannot unhear 5 words said to your face by a woman who has been waiting 50 years to say them. So let me put the last piece in, because you cannot understand where this is going without seeing the shape of the monarchy William is building, and where inside that shape Camilla fits, which is to say, where she does not. William has been consistent about this for years, and the consistency is not accidental. Fewer working royals, tighter control over who represents the crown, 0 tolerance for outside financial relationships that even look like conflicts of interest. The public face of the monarchy is, increasingly and by deliberate design, William, Catherine, Charles, and Anne. 4 people. A smaller group is far easier to control. Fewer informal relationships, fewer undeclared yacht trips, fewer gaps in the governance framework that somebody with a folder of documents can walk through. And Catherine's position inside that new structure has been transformed. She came back to full public duties in early 2025 after her cancer treatment, and immediately took on a load that went well beyond the traditional role of a Princess of Wales. Her office now handles major coordination. She attends strategy discussions that historically would not have included her. One source described her as a co-strategist rather than a supporting spouse. That is not a ceremonial title. That is a working description of where the real authority sits in the household that is about to inherit everything. Against that backdrop, Camilla's reduced position is not a temporary punishment. It is not a consequence that will soften when the dust settles and the relationships repair themselves. There is no version of this where the relationships repair themselves in the direction Camilla needs them to go. The diary entries that went to Catherine are not coming back. The staff that were restructured out of her household are not returning. Windsor Lodge is not going to quietly revert to her once the current unpleasantness is managed. The monarchy William is building has a center of gravity, and she is not part of it. And she has known it for months, and there is nothing she can do about it. She spent 25 years believing she had won. She had the ring. She had the title. She had the crown on her head at Westminster Abbey, and she had the walls of that palace arranged exactly the way she wanted them. Every trace of the other woman in a box, or behind a locked door, or wrapped up in protective covering in a storage room. She was about to walk into the result of all of it. The most beloved royal of her generation put back on the wall she was always owed. Her patronages lifted back into the light. Her name spoken inside official communications with a frequency and a depth of respect that has not existed since before she died. And Camilla standing in a building she thought she had won, walking past a room that is no longer hers, past a wall she is not allowed to touch, past a portrait she spent 25 years removing from the building, with 5 words from her sister-in-law following her down every corridor, with a husband who will not lift a finger, with a future king who has never once forgotten whose shadow hangs over his childhood, and who has now demonstrated to the whole country that he is prepared to act on it. William was 15 years old when he walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London. He made himself a promise that day, and then he did the hardest thing a furious person can do, which is nothing at all for 25 years, while he built the ground underneath it so carefully that nobody could ever pull it out from under him. Windsor Lodge is not the end of this. It is the latest move in a game that ends when William is king, and every decision about Camilla's life inside the institution passes to a man she has been afraid of since he was 16 years old. She knew it was coming. She simply believed she had more time. She did not.